Please note, we would like to make it very clear, we are totally against the form of discipline described in the articles and accounts being used on minors and non-consenting adults. Although some of these accounts are fictional, and others may be an exaggerated reality, none of them are too far from the truth of what really happened back in those days. If you are enjoying our stories, please do subscribe to this channel. We will be posting many more stories as time goes by.
Embarrassment at witnessing spankings. First, let me say I have never been spanked and I still feel embarrassed that I enjoy this subject. I am not sure when my interest started, but I remember seeing my friend get spanked by our teacher in junior school, must have been about 10. The thing that struck me was how embarrassed she was by it. When the teacher, Miss Hopwood, called her up to the front of the class for talking, she was counting on her fingers to show that rather than talking she had been counting. Miss Hopwood put her over her knee, lifted up her skirt and spanked her bottom really hard. When she stood up, her face was red, and for some reason, she continued counting on her fingers all the way back to her seat. In this school, I also saw a girl called Christine Brown bent over in the corridor, and the headmistress had lifted her skirt up, pulled one side of her knickers into her crack, and was smacking her bare buttock. I was shocked. Also, in my second year of senior school, mixed comprehensive, there were a number of classroom canings, all boys. Girls were sent to the headmistress for the slipper. 3 of my girlfriends were slippered by her one after the other over her knee on the seat of their knickers for trying to pull a boy's trousers down. I was upset that day, but they told me all about it afterward. I remember feeling surprised that they didn't seem to feel embarrassed, as if it had been me I would have kept it to myself. Outside of school, my best friend told me that her dad spanked her on the bare bottom. I often heard him say things like, "Do you want your bottom smacked?" And once when I stayed overnight and we were all giggling, he called up that if he had to come up he would turn their backsides the color of a roast chicken. She told me that one evening, after being told to quieten down several times, her dad came into her bedroom where she slept with her younger sister, ordered her sister over his knee, pulled down her pajamas and tanned her until she was crying. She tried to pretend she was asleep, but he pulled her up and gave her the same. I remember her saying to me that at least it was just his hand, as another friend of ours called Linda got the belt. Apparently, her dad made her pull down her knickers, lift up her skirt and bend over the bed for a spanking with his belt. A part of me secretly wanted to be spanked, but it seemed so humiliating. Personally, I found witnessing school corporal punishment considerably less embarrassing than being in receipt of it in front of a mixed class. Of my 2 experiences of the latter, thankfully only one involved clothing adjustment, but in both, I was acutely conscious of being the center of attention, the unwilling star of the show, so to speak. But I was a very shy little lad, and some other pupils certainly found the experience rather less taxing. Your own schools may possibly have been a little unusual as regards the modus operandi of SCP. I'd have said that classroom over-the-knee spanking was a little unusual, and at secondary school, I'd have expected your headmistress to require errant girls destined for the slipper to bend over in some manner other than over her knee. But then one thing in which UK schools, assuming that you attended a UK school, was definitely not consistent was SCP. The technique employed by your junior school headmistress to expose the target area when smacking the unfortunate Christine Brown was, I would think, quite rare. I did see a somewhat more common technique for securing enhanced exposure, gym knickers required to be pulled up really tight, employed when a female classmate was slippered in the last year of junior school. However, had there actually been an I Spy Spankings book as this rather droll contribution by former contributor Ketter envisaged, I reckon that your corridor sighting would have been a 50-pointer. The method is known here as the Davenport denudational deviation, having been alleged, falsely it appears, to have been used by a female teacher of that name when preparing unfortunate girls bent over the headmaster's desk for receipt of the headmaster's cane at a 1970s secondary school. It was apparently a feature of the notorious 1964 Helston Grammar School corporal punishment incident as reported by the press. Additionally, a former contributor to this forum, some of whose writings have been assembled here, claimed to have encountered it at her 1960s boarding school. If you feel able to supply the information, it would be most interesting to know when and approximately where you were at school. I don't mind supplying the information as it did happen. The incident when my classmate was spanked over the knee happened in 1967 or 1968 at my junior school, Southbury Road Infants and Junior School in Enfield. This is also where I saw Christine having her knickers pulled into her bottom crack and spanked, but it was probably a year or two earlier and she was about 2 years older than me. I have never heard of this before and thought it was just the way this particular teacher did it, but have just had a look at the link, so thanks for that. The slipperings were in my school in Tetbury, Gloucestershire about 1971, as we had moved to the West Country by then. I didn't actually witness the slipperings, but I have no reason to doubt my friends' accounts, especially as there were 3 of them with the same story. We were 13 at the time. I think what you said about being embarrassed at my interest in this subject is true. I have never actually told anybody about this. I prefer the true experience to a fantasy, that's just my preference. I am interested in both school and home punishments as long as they are not fictitious. I saw other slipperings and canines, but I found the incidents that I wrote about particularly interesting. Caning and slipperings were extremely common in the schools I attended. It was just taken for granted as a consequence of bad behavior. The same was true of domestic discipline, just not in my home. Thanks again for your welcome, and I hope to be able to contribute again soon. Although I think I was about 15 years ahead of you, our school experience seems to have been similar in that SCP was common, though in my case somewhat less common at secondary school, and taken for granted as a consequence of bad behavior. Also, although domestic CP of youngsters was common in our respective childhoods, we didn't incur it. Like you, although I saw a lot of SCP, certain incidents made a special impression. As unlike you, I did personally experience SCP. In my case, one of these incidents was becoming the first child in my year to be in receipt of it. Only by a hair's breadth, admittedly, as when Miss B made her surprise raid on morning playground lineup, chatterers, another boy and a girl from my class were also netted. However, when we were marched into Miss B's classroom and lined up in front of her class, I found myself second in the queue for a smack leg, behind a girl from Miss B's class of older children, and so took the first in-year prize, even if only on a technicality. You said in your first contribution, a part of me secretly wanted to be spanked, but it seemed so humiliating. I certainly found my smack leg experience humiliating and embarrassing, what with the clothing adjustment and all. A sentiment exacerbated by the fact that while the girl in front of me was being dealt with, I'd had the opportunity to note that some of the watching class were finding our predicament quite amusing. It hurt as well, and my tears added to the embarrassment. That experience put me off trying to graduate to the cane. Thereafter I dodged SCP other than a light slippering towards the end of junior school. However, on arrival here I was conscious of a certain deficiency in personal experience in receipt of the subject of the forum vis-à-vis some of those then posting. I would have been very happy to have been able to regale readers with details of how in my first year at secondary school I had to bend over in my short trousers for 6 of the best from the head girl in front of the assembled prefects to boost my status. Of course, such an account would have been complete fiction. My secondary school was all male, other than the head secretary, the matron, and the dinner ladies, that is. The prefects at my secondary school were entitled to an award and delivered up to 3 strokes of the cane as one of the penalties available to them in the weekly prefects' court. In fact, the only time I saw a cane in my whole school career was the one on the table on the occasion of my only appearance before the prefects' court. It aroused considerable trepidation, but luckily I got lines. However, my account of this has occasioned doubts here about whether prefects could possibly still have been wielding the cane as late as the end of the 1950s. In fact, this was the case in a high proportion of public schools. As late as 1966, the Calton report found that 62% of headmasters' conference schools still allowed boys to administer corporal punishment to other boys. On balance, I might have done better with that fictitious account of a caning by the head girl. At the schools I attended in South London back in the 50s, early 60s, canings were usually administered in the privacy of the headmaster's study. In cases where miscreants were spanked before their classmates, though, the shame and humiliation of being chastised in front of the whole class was very much part of their punishment. I'm speaking from experience here. A detailed account of the spanking I received in front of the class at my primary school has appeared in a previous post. I'm sure that my face was as red as my bottom as I made my way back to my desk that day. The girl who sat in front of me in class made no secret of the fact that she disliked me intensely, and she was obviously taking great pleasure in witnessing my public humiliation. She was a very pretty girl, and if they_L can find the group picture taken during the St. John's school journey to Belgium in 1958 that appeared on a previous thread, I'll point her out. Patricia had a mean streak though and continued to tease me mercilessly. Girls at junior school could be quite formidable. At my junior school it was the practice of some teachers to seat a boy and a girl in each if the two-person tip-up seat desk units were never possible. I believe this was based on the theory that girls were better behaved than boys and would exercise a beneficial restraining influence on their seating partner. I was certainly terrified in some or of most of the girls unofficially charged with moderating my behavior by this means. When I was slippered in front of the class for forgetting my football kit, the girl with whom I shared a desk in the back row was very much less than sympathetic. She considered that I'd let the side down. Those of us in the back row were there because we were the class goody-goodies, academically inclined and well-behaved, safe to be seated far from the teacher's eagle eye. My desk partner made it quite clear that by having to make that long trudge to the front of the class to bend over and be whacked in front of everybody, I'd fallen well short of her high standards. And events at junior school can cast a long shadow. The girl concerned and I both had to spend 2 years in the top class because of birthdays and the entry requirements of the 11+ examination. I was slippered in the first of those 2 years. Almost at the end of the second year, age nearly 12, desk partnerships had been reshuffled and a reasonably amicable relationship had been restored. Sadly, this proved the girl's downfall as she chose to speak to me in a PT class. PT is a misnomer really. It was actually a sort of on-the-spot drill session, and she happened to be positioned in front of me, so turning and chatting was easy. Talking wasn't allowed in PT, but our class teacher turned a blind eye. The temporary teacher taking us that day didn't. In hindsight, he was almost certainly what is known here as a kinky teacher and was probably seeking an opportunity to slipper one of the prettier girls in the class. But as I said, junior school can cast a long shadow. And here I am. The teacher who administered the slippering to my junior school female classmate was male. It was very near the end of the school year and our female class teacher was away for a few days. If anyone told us why, I've forgotten, but the male teacher was covering for her. He was new at the school and didn't have a class of his own. He didn't stay in teaching very long and a few years later was still around the area as an insurance agent. I should perhaps explain that this was 1954. The school was bulging at the seams with the post-war baby boomers and didn't have enough classroom space. There were classes everywhere, the school hall, the corridors, the dinner room. Even so, there wasn't enough room, and for the 2 years I was in it, the top A stream class of 50+ was outstationed in a room in a church hall a short walk from the school, a building which was otherwise unused during the day on weekdays. Presumably that class was selected as older academically inclined kids were perhaps less likely to riot and overwhelm the teacher, who was the only adult on the premises. Modern teachers wouldn't countenance teaching 50+ children by themselves, no teaching assistants in those days, let alone with no possibility of rapid adult assistance. However, junior school teachers in those days were made of sterner stuff. And of course they had the respect of parents and children and the means to enforce discipline if required. The above context is important because if the temporary male teacher was indeed inclined to kinkiness and set on slippering a pretty girl, as I now suspect was possibly the case, he had the perfect operational environment. No other adults around, and the area where we did PT in fine weather was outside at the back of the building, not overlooked and as far as it was possible to get from any chance visitors to the premises. He didn't slipper or smack anyone else during his few days with us though, so perhaps he was just a strict disciplinarian with an aversion to children who talked when they were supposed to be silent, rather than of the ilk who once featured on the masthead of this forum. The evidence does seem to favor the latter though. Other children, girls and boys, had broken the no-talking rule in that PT lesson before my classmate was singled out. It is scarcely possible that he didn't notice them. And of course he didn't slipper me, though most teachers would have probably have judged me equally culpable as a participant in the conversation. But of course I was neither female nor even slightly pretty, whereas my female classmate, from an affluent family and hence well-nourished in an era when many children were half-starved by modern standards, was probably the most comely girl in the class. Possibly you were at school in later years whenever tighter and skimpier gym knickers were inflicted on unfortunate schoolgirls, to the delight of schoolboys and the despair of the girls themselves, many of whom ended up hating formal exercise of any sort as a result. However, in the mid-1950s gym knickers were relatively voluminous, and to achieve a significant degree of the effect you describe what is known here as the Dorothy denudational deviation, from the punitive knicker-adjusting habit of the headmistress of a former contributor, would have been required. Even for the most determinedly kinky male teacher, that would probably have been a bridge too far in the circumstances. Girls being slippered weren't a great rarity. An anxious face surveying the class from a posture bent over a front desk. The sight of the teacher wielding the slipper, the sound of the wax, and perhaps some tears. If you were in front of the class in the queue for the slipper yourself, the sight of slipper striking skirt would, I think, have tended to increase apprehension at one's own impending fate rather than any excitement at seeing a girl being whacked. I may be wrong, of course. The only time I was slippered the miscreants were all male. But the fate of my classmate was in a different league. The whole thing was highly ritualistic. This, doubtless with the added imperative that I too should have been on the receiving end of the slipper, was probably why it made such an impression on me.